right, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on this distinguished panel with two experts in maritime policy. And, you've heard about highway, you've heard about air today, and now we go into an area that's really been affected in recent years by things such as supply chain issues. It's really increased port traffic recently. So. I'm Sterling Wiggins. I'm with the supply chain team here at the Chamber. I joined the Chamber from the Maritime Administration at DOT and their supply chain team. And I'm joined here by Commissioner Sam Cho from the Port of Seattle. In the interest of time, just do very, very short intros, but you can find their full information in the program. Commissioner Cho was appointed to the Seattle Port Commission in 2019. And also founder of Seven Seas Export, international trading company headquartered in Seattle. And before that, served in the Obama administration as well as in the House of Representatives. And I'm also joined here by Derek Miller from the American Association of Port Authorities, who handles the U.S. Coast Guard, Customs and Border Protection, FEMA, and cybersecurity for AAPA. And prior to joining AAPA, he worked for Stoveboat LLC, a public affairs firm specializing in maritime issues. So thank you and welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So to get things kicked off, if you both want to talk about how seaports fit into the prevention of human trafficking and specifically the roles that ports play when it comes to human trafficking and preventing it.
Yeah, so obviously a large majority of the trafficking that happens goes through ports. I think the number breaks down to about 60% in airports and the remainder, a lot of it happening at seaports as well. I think there's distinctions, though, between the maritime and aviation sides. I think at the Port of Seattle, one of our distinct advantages and that we have is that we are a port authority that manages both an airport and a seaport. And to my knowledge, the only other port authority that might have that is New York. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of synergy there in terms of what we do. You know, when it comes to human trafficking, I see it as having four pillars. The first one is training. So we train all our employees on human trafficking awareness. The second one is awareness of public awareness, right? People who may not know the signs of human trafficking, we put up signs and all the great things that you've heard already. And so we do that at our maritime facilities as well. The third thing is having the appropriate protocols and standard operating procedures within the port so that when an employee or a bystander sees an instance of human trafficking, they know what to do. And then the last wing is partnerships. And I think that's where the maritime side is, a distinct challenge because it's not as clean and crisp in terms of, how vertically integrated the industry is. It's a little more fragmented than the aviation industry, for instance. And so I think the maritime side still has a lot of hurdles.
The last group talked a little bit about border crossings and things like that. Ports are borders too. And they're the first stop, especially for imported goods, before things enter the country, before they get on trucks, maybe they get on planes, they travel some other way. They're really the first stop, and therefore they can serve as the first line of defense and the first place where an educated workforce can spot something that's wrong and maybe prevent it from getting on a truck or spreading throughout the country. So I think that's really where ports have an opportunity as that first spot.
And I want to clarify real quickly that I think on the maritime side, we talk about different versions of or variations of human trafficking. A lot of labor trafficking happens on the maritime side as to maybe the sex trafficking that we think of initially. You think we are the largest cruise terminal on the West Coast, right? So the cruise industry, the commercial fishing industry, we have public marinas. Who here has watched The Deadliest Catch on Discovery? Those vessels are all home ported here at the Port of Seattle. And so a lot of the labor trafficking happens, and I realize, and directly answer your question, a lot of the labor trafficking happens on the maritime side.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about some of the efforts that ports have taken specifically? I know Seattle's made some significant investments starting in 2018 in this area.
Yeah, so our impetus for this was actually, I have to give credit to a predecessor of mine, Courtney Gregoire, who occupied this seat prior to my joining the port. But there was a pretty big news story in Seattle of a sex trafficking ring that was broken up in a suburb called Bellevue, and these were South Korean women who were being trafficked into the area, and that was around 2017, and in 2018 is when we started our efforts. And so the first thing that we did was, again, the training. And in terms of training, we had, because we are a port that has both aviation and maritime, we had to have two different trainings, right? The things you look for on the maritime side are very different from the aviation side. And so we had flights to freedom, which is more on the aviation side, and the ports to freedom, which is more on the maritime side. And so that's how we got started. And then what we did is we took it more regionally. So instead of it just being the Port of Seattle doing this, we actually brought in the county, Sound Transit, which is one of our light rail authorities, and we created a regional and then a statewide effort on human trafficking. And I would say right now there's an effort on the state legislature to create to pass a bill that would actually create wraparound services for victims of human trafficking. And I heard someone on a previous panel talk about this. But oftentimes, if you look at the circumstances under which people are exploited, right, you can pull them out. But if you don't change those circumstances, likelihood is that they might fall back into it or become victim again, right? And so for what we did during the pandemic, especially, we actually put money in, and we actually had a program that trained vulnerable populations as well as victims of human trafficking and gave them jobs at the port, right? So that they had a livelihood. And so that's one of the things that we're actually working on now, is creating job training opportunities for victims of human trafficking so that they have, so that livelihood element of exploitation is no longer a factor.
What AAPA, I think, has been trying to do, it was mentioned on a previous panel, you know, the leaders of the organizations have to buy in before the general employment buys in. But that general employment is on the front lines, whether it's, you know, port workers, a longshoreman, or a flight attendant. Those are the people who can spot things. So I think what we've been doing as an association, Port of Seattle is a leader on this, so we've been trying to talk about that with all of our members and let them know that, you know, this education is available. You should train your workforce. But in my day-to-day, I spend a lot of time with heads of security at Port X or director of safety at Port Y, and try to get them to buy into this, whether it's going through the training first so that they can tout it or, you know, work with that group to eventually spread it to their employees. I think that's where an association like ours comes in to really promote the awareness that there is education and that there are ways of dealing with this.
One thing we've learned recently is, well, the public has learned recently, is that ports are really part of a whole ecosystem when it comes to importing goods in the United States. That requires engagement not just within the port authority itself, but also with your business partners. Can you talk a little bit about how you've engaged your private sector business partners?
Yeah, so actually literally last week, we rolled out with a program called Port Allies Against Human Trafficking. We are a landlord-tenant port, like many ports in this country, and so although we own all the properties that port operations happen on, we have tenants that actually do the day-to-day work, right? It's very similar to an airport where the airlines are actually the ones operating the planes and the gates and everything, right? And so what we did is we created this program called Port Allies Against Human Trafficking, which is a pledge that our tenants sign, right? And so our tenants are making a commitment to train their employees on the awareness. I mentioned the training aspect as being key. Well, up until this point, it had just been employees directly employed by the Port of Seattle. That's all we have control over, right? We can't force our tenants to train their employees. And so what we've done is we've gone to our tenants and said, hey, we want you to be a part of this. Quite frankly, your staff and your workers are the ones on the ground, right? Whether you're a gate agent or someone working the docks, right? And you should be a part of the solution. If anyone here is contemplating a partnership with the private sector, one advice I would give is that make sure you try to make that training as seamless and as easy as possible for the employers, right? One of the pushbacks that I got when I pushed this out as a policy at the port was like, well, you're telling me I got to spend another hour in training, right? So that takes away from the time that they have to actually be doing their work, right? Employers actually have to compensate them for an extra hour of training, right? And so think of ways that you can actually integrate that training into what they are already doing or what is being done. And I think you will get far less resistance from your private sector partners.
Yeah, and I think, think about the places where your partners, at ports, you have truckers coming in, you have vendors coming in and going. Think about the places where you touch them. So it's at the front gate when you're swiping their access card. That's maybe where you have information. It's in the crew rest area, where the truck's waiting to pick up a container. There might be information there. So even if they're not your employees, direct employees, if they're your tenant, if they're truckers, there's an opportunity for them to see what the initiative is at the port and how they can participate. It's probably not, like Sam has done. It might not be full training like they have done with their tenants, but just an awareness that there's this culture at your facility, I think, is going a long way towards helping.
And following on to that, can you talk about some of the resources that are available for ports?
Yeah, so I was having a conversation with Mar, actually, who raised a great question earlier. And I think, perhaps with the exception of Seattle and a couple of other ports, I don't think the seaport industry, the maritime industry, has done quite as much as the trucking industry, as the airline industry. So one of the reasons I wanted to come today is basically to pitch DHS and all, DOT. Get involved with seaports. We'd love to be a part of that. I think, we have private sector partners. There are nonprofits. Some ports are taking advantage of that. But I do think we could do a better job of partnering with government and partnering with nonprofits to raise the profile of this. Because sometimes I think, ports compete with each other, and I don't think anyone wants to be the first one to say, hey, we're adopting this training, we're embracing this, because it might lead someone to think there's a problem at that port. There's a problem at port X, so we're going to move to port Y. So I think if there's kind of a common understanding that it's not just at one port, ports will avail themselves more of government and nonprofit resources.
Commissioner Cho, I know Seattle recently won the DOT's Human Trafficking Impact Award. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that project was?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, let me just thank the Department of Transportation for their partnership and for giving us this great honor. I also want to give a shout out to a few members of my team here. Delmas Whitaker here, Chad Aldridge. They're both staff at the Port of Seattle who spearhead a lot of our work at the port. And they actually both, Delmas represents the maritime side and Chad actually works on the aviation side. The funding that we'll be receiving from the U.S. Department of Transportation will go towards a program. I realize this is a maritime panel, but the award was actually for an aviation program that we're putting together called Airports United Against Human Trafficking. And in essence, the program is acknowledging that 60% of trafficking happens through airports, and then acknowledging also that this is not it doesn't happen in isolation. And so what we're aiming to do is actually create a coalition of airports throughout the country and create a steering committee, and then create standard operating procedures and kind of create uniformity across the country and across different airports so that we can actually all work together in conjunction with each other. You heard, Seattle is at the forefront, I believe, in these efforts, but it's now, it's like a balloon. You squeeze a balloon, the air doesn't disappear, it just pops out somewhere else. And so as great as we are at tackling human trafficking in this Seattle port, we need to start taking that regionally and nationally. And so our effort and our award will be focused on creating a coalition of airports throughout the country that are all on the same page when it comes to anti-human trafficking.
Interesting. All right, well, we want to open up the panel to some questions now from the audience. If anyone has any questions, feel free.
My question is for Commissioner Cho. First off, thank you for providing employment opportunities for survivors. That is something that I think is amazing and should be replicated everywhere. My question is, while you were doing that, were there any challenges that you faced, because a lot of the survivors may have arrest records as a result of their lived experience? Thank you.
It's a very interesting question, and that's a question that I think my staff would know better than I would. I mean, obviously, I wasn't directly involved with the hiring process and stuff like that. But I think part of what we're trying to do is provide resources that helps deal with those situations. And the reality is that, excuse me, the reality is that you talked about arrests and records, but there's also a lot of trauma involved, right? And I would imagine that going back to the scene of the crime is also not a great thing for survivors as well. And so, I hope that as we move forward with providing new opportunities and trainings to people who are looking for work, that we can be more cognizant of that and then provide the wraparound service that will help deal with that stuff. So I don't have an exact answer for you. I'm sure my staff can follow up and answer that question for you. But I appreciate the point you're making.
Any other questions?
I've got a question. I'm Christy Weigel with United Against Slavery. And so, again, Sam, it was great meeting you because we actually received the first Impact Award. And that's kind of what my question is about on the level of training. So we're getting ready to publish the National Outreach Survey for Transportation data. And we did notice that within the data collected that Maritime is heavily under participating. And again, the excellent work that BLI has done, aviation ended up having more than 50% of the data that we collected. Roadways, again, you look at, TAT, everything they're doing. MAR was so helpful with some of the questions that we developed for Maritime. We also worked with Erlene at the Port Authority in New York and the Port of Oakland. Both of those distributed the survey. But my question is about training. So some of the data and some of the feedback that we've gotten is that it is easier to train land workers versus sea workers. And so again, even with this new coalition that you're putting together, Sam, and even for what you all are doing, Derek, to help push this initiative throughout the different port authorities, what different efforts could be made to reach the sea workers versus the land workers so that that they're getting trained not just on sex trafficking but also land trafficking? Because some of the feedback that's what we received is that it's easier to train land than it is for the sea.
And maybe I might have an answer as to why that's the case. And my theory is that there's far more turnover on sea workers than there are land workers. Right? If you look at people who work at maritime ports, the gate operators, the longshoremen are longshoremen their entire lives, right? But if you're looking for a merchant marine or a seafarer, the chances are that they're not career or they're not there for 10, 20, 30 years, and there's a lot of turnover there. The other issue on the maritime side is that that labor might be the labor trafficking, like they might themselves be, taking advantage of or exploited, right? They could be workers from other countries like Southeast Asia that are being, put on the boats to work, right? And so I'm not surprised that that is the case, and I can't tell you that I have a solution right now, but I think that at some point, the training and awareness of human trafficking needs to go international. It needs to be done on an international level, right? So that there are countries that are working together on this and not just happening on one side of the equation. And so that's what I would suggest, because if a lot of those folks are coming from, whatever part of the world to work on those vessels, it's hard to reach them, right? And then if you have that turnover, it makes it that much harder, right? A lot of the work is seasonal, right? Whether it's cruise, fishing, commercial fishing, it's seasonal work, right? And so there's far more challenges on the maritime side because it's far more complicated and fragmented than on the aviation side.
This is not a great answer, but building off of that, I think he's absolutely right. But I also think the training for maritime has to be very specific. As Commissioner Cho mentioned at the very beginning of the panel, the trafficking that happens at seaports is completely different. It looks completely different than it does anywhere else. It is labor. It's not typically young women or things like that. It is labor. So one of the ways to make it a little better maybe is having more really specific training for those port workers.
Next question.
Yes, I have a question. My name is Alexander Delgado. I'm the public policy manager at ECPAT USA. Derek, you mentioned the problem that we've been facing quite a lot in that when we do outreach to schools and to a lot of the transportation agencies, they have a fear that that addressing human trafficking might seem like there's a problem with human trafficking at the ports. What do you think are the best strategies to alleviate some of these agencies' fears?
Yeah, so I think that's, again, where the role of a trade association comes in. We have 80 seaport members around the country, and I think, doing some kind of initial outreach, whether it's having your group come present or hosting a webinar or having you come to one of our events, I think that's an opportunity where everyone's in the same room, everyone's on the same playing field, they get the information they need, and then they can hopefully feel more comfortable with making a decision. Another thing, if the association itself was sponsoring some kind of a program or co-branding a program, then it's a benefit of the association. Why not take advantage of it rather than, well, we have this problem, we have to go find something to take care of it. So I think those are opportunities to deal with that.
Any additional questions?
I'm Mara Bretman with BEST. I just had a quick comment in response to Christie's question. We worked with, we started working with the hotel industry a decade ago, and we've had the exact same challenges that we're having now in the maritime industry, which is a lack of awareness, a sort of denial, because this is such a difficult issue, right? This doesn't happen on American flag vessels. I mean, those are the kind of things we're hearing that we heard a decade ago in the hotel industry, whereas I think it just takes time and education. And so I'm so excited to see you here today, Derek, and of course, Commissioner Cho, your leadership. BEST does provide training specific to the maritime industry that we were very grateful to get support from the Port of Seattle to be able to develop. So the training is there. And so I'm really excited to continue working with you all and see more awareness in the industry about the impacts, especially on labor and sex trafficking.
Can I ask, Mars not on the panel, but the hotel industry has the same seasonal issues. Do you have any insight on how that was dealt with in the hotel industry? Seasonal and transient workers?
Now they're requiring all new employees to get training. And so I think we would need to see that, at least some level of awareness on the maritime side. I think one of the And being able to have the training available in multiple languages will be important as well. Right now, our languages are limited in what's available, but if we can provide it through, our training's available through mobile phones, so just being able to provide that through a mobile phone is an option. One advantage we have in the maritime industry is it is a really tight-knit industry. Right, and so when you get folks like Port of Seattle started and engaged, I think it's going to go really quickly because it's such a tight-knit industry, but it's just the lack of understanding that people have about the impact.
Any additional questions? All right, we'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.